I'm back from a quick Christmas break and we have to do some catch-up. So that's actually old news. On the 24th of December, we got some news from the Chinese equivalent of the SEC. So I saw that a couple of YouTubers out there already talked about it, and I'm really happy about this because on one hand side, we have this, what I think is kind of a false narrative in the media. And on the other hand, we have retail investors and also some smart people on YouTube and hopefully Twitter that are actually already waking up and showing what's really been going on. So if you would have just read this article by Bloomberg, China to tighten foreign IPOs may ban some on national security. The whole article is again around this fear about the Chinese regulators, the Didi issue, VIE Structure, Chinese companies prevented to go on IPO to foreign exchanges. But I will be looking at the primary sources, what those Chinese regulators actually said, and kind of debunk some of the myths here. And some of these narratives have now been spread on the media a couple of weeks or months long already. The first one would be that China doesn't want their companies to be overlooked or audited by the PCAOB, so the US regulators or auditors there. The second one would be that China doesn't want their companies to go on foreign exchanges or overseas in general and do IPOs. And the third one, that China doesn't acknowledge the VIE structure, so this legal framework that has been used for many companies to actually go overseas and list abroad. So I'm going to show you what the actually authority body in China, the China Securities Regulatory Commission, so that's the equivalent of the Chinese SEC, actually published on the 24th of December around rules for overseas listings. First, again, a little bit of context. This all started with Didi going IPO in the US without actually listening to the warnings of the regulators that they should delay the IPO for now because there are issues around some security topics, and they did it anyways by the pressure of the management, but also international investors that are invested in the companies, and basically they want to seek their IPO exit. That's when they can sell their shares and get their profits. And so Didi went ahead and do this overseas listing, and that's when things escalated. We know the whole story later on, and now basically the Chinese regulators have come out with a rule set or some guidance of how they seek in the future such kind of IPO listings should be done. And so basically the response and the news here is that China Securities Regulatory Commission is now publicly asking the opinions from relevant systems and bodies of proposing rules how in the future Chinese companies can go overseas and list, for instance, in the US. And in a Q&A with a reporter, they stated how they are intending to doing that. First, they will apply a filing requirement to new offerings and listings. So this is only relevant for new initial public filing offerings, not for companies that have already listed overseas. And those kind of Chinese companies will first need to go through those filing processes before they can actually list overseas. So basically, there will be more detail to the exact process of this in the future after this public hearing. But the big message here is that Chinese companies will continue to be allowed to be listed overseas. And this is a big signal countering basically the narrative that China doesn't want its companies to go overseas anymore and basically also doesn't want to allow them. That's something we've heard quite a couple of times after the whole Didi fiasco. But no, just like I've always mentioned, China wants this to be happening in a more regular manner because previously China couldn't really interfere of having any say in how companies are going overseas. And after this, they will finally have a way of allowing companies to go overseas again. And this, I think, will lead to new IPOs of Chinese companies, maybe already in 2022. And this is the news that we didn't hear in Bloomberg or any other Western media, really, that actually this is a positive signal and we may see those IPOs that have been stopped for now because of this uncertainty to be resumed next year then. But the Chinese regulators dropped even more really good news in my views during this Q&A with the reporters about cross-border cooperation with securities regulations. They mentioned the CSRC will further promote cross-border securities regulation cooperation with our international counterparts. So this obviously is amongst others the SEC in the US as well as the PCAOB. And as said, firstly, we will enhance information sharing by establishing a filing information relaying mechanism mechanism. So this may actually be about a direct answer to the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, which wants financial information going out from China to the US. And most importantly, they also said we will proactively promote cross-border cooperation in audit supervision so as to create a sound regulatory environment for overseas listings. So this is exactly what the US regulators want from China. Right now we have the situation that Chinese companies cannot get any audit supervision by the PCAOB. Although Chinese companies are audited by PricewaterhouseCoopers and so on, but still the US regulators cannot look into those audits by the Chinese offices that are overlooking those companies. And now it seems, based on this statement, that China will look into how they can share this kind of information, which is now mostly deemed a national security. And so while this is not the final statement of how they are exactly going to do it and for which aspects and all of the details, still this is a very clear signal, and it's showing the intent and the willingness of the Chinese side to actually start with the request from the United States. And there's even more in this interview. The CSRC has been asked about their attitude towards the overseas listings companies that are using the so-called VIE structure, so an overseas shell company that investors are investing in order to work around the issue that Chinese companies themselves cannot go and list overseas. And authorities replying here that basically if domestic laws and regulations are adhered to, then the VIE structure should be eligible for those companies to go overseas. And the translation to that is that basically China acknowledges the VIE structure and thinks that it is necessary for the Chinese companies to be able to list overseas. Once again, this is busting another myth that we've heard before, that China is not acknowledging the VIE structure or even deems it illegal, and thereby, even makes the whole Chinese overseas listing illegal that way. But that's clearly not the case. So basically the Chinese regulators have here responded to the most important issues around US listed Chinese companies and have really stated their intent from at least the Chinese side of working towards an opening and also resolving these issues. And parts of it, of course, has to happen through new rules and regulations that will guide a clear way of how this can happen in the future. And while I think there is still a time of uncertainty and some operational questions and a question how this will be exactly executed until the deadline of end of January, until they have heard all the opinions, and then afterwards how it's going to be exactly implemented, I still think the things are now kind of coming together. And actually, if you remember these slides that I talked through about the Chinese crackdown and the regulatory framework that's currently being implemented, I think that actually the cybersecurity law and also the data security law and the personal information protection law that have now just all been coming into place and implemented are actually even building the framework now to see that now Chinese companies might be able to share this information also with the US side, because now there are actually straight rules being implemented, also being defined what is the critical information infrastructure. So possibly infrastructure companies like the telecoms and so on will in the future be defined explicitly as companies that cannot share such information. And maybe Didi will actually also fall within that, but possibly for most other Chinese companies that are listed in the US, those rules may not apply, and they will be able just to share the information as any other Western companies that are actually doing business in China are able to share the information and data cross-border. So this is not only actually a requirement for Chinese companies only, but also for international companies. But of course, in terms of how the companies can be listed in the US and how the oversight of these companies works, it is actually a crucial factor. But now it seems like everything is coming into place, And yeah, big respect for everyone who's looking through this media FUD. I've seen that a couple of people commenting on Twitter and so on are getting quite annoyed by the takes of the media and also starting to cancel their subscriptions from Doomberg and the others. But well, let's see how this all plays out. For now, of course, it's the big day for the shorts. They can still use this negative sentiment and the negative news that's coming out. But in the end, in the very long run, the fundamentals and what actually happens in the end will be this decisive factor of those companies and also their valuations. So yeah, I hope you liked this and found it informational. What's your take? Let me know down in the comments, and then see you in the next video.